Where we left off on Monday was we were talking about multiple awards and the different types of multiple awards and why you do it and some of the considerations. And even though I don't like to end in the middle of a topic because then you forget what the first part was, and so you either go back and rehash it or you kind of are left hanging. And here we're going to leave you hanging and we're just going to keep going on, and hopefully you can go back with the slides and piece together the beginning of this particular segment. So what we're talking about is from the notion of vendors and why you do multiple awards versus a single award in some circumstances is that if you do a single award for circumstances when you don't need how many times you're going to need the vendor to provide the subject matter of the contract, both from a quantity standpoint and particularly from a timing standpoint. It's one thing if we can say to a vendor, we're going to need one of these a week for the next year. Then they know to gear up to produce one a week for 52 weeks. They can anticipate that. When you say, we want you to be available when and where and how we want you to be available. And we're not going to guarantee anything. We can't tell you whether we're going to need 52, 10, 0, whatever. And if we want 10, do we want 10 one time, 10 times of one, or do we want at the same time 10 of them? When you think of the dynamics of that, vendors, unless they have huge capacity, and we talked about UPS, Federal Express, etc., they can handle virtually anything anybody throws at them anytime because they're geared to do that. But most vendors, for unknown demand situations, just can't provide something on a dime, so to speak. And so if you require that by having a single award in that type of environment, this is what we're focusing on now. This is what a vendor will have to do. They either will have to have the capacity sitting there ready, waiting to deliver it to you, and if you do, they charge you, and if they don't have anything to charge, but they have an expense, so they're going to have to really charge you for the instances where you do use it. Or they're going to claim they have the capacity, and if you never use it or only use it intermittently, everything will be fine. But if you ever do come to the situation where you need a lot at one time, they might just say, can't do it. And you're left with, okay, what do you do in that situation? Because the vendor says they can't provide it, and maybe you have damages, maybe you don't, but the bottom line is you're not getting what you need through that contract. So you're either going to do without, or you're going to do an emergency, a small procurement, something else. But the procurement with the single award did not satisfy your needs. So that's why we're explaining the circumstances where you could go to multiple awards scenario. So I think I've kind of explained that, hopefully. If they have idle capacity, variable costs will be covered if their price is better. So basically, if you come to them and it's the situation where they're sitting there and they have repair techs or whatever sitting there without another assignment, that they're just sitting around waiting for a call, and you call and they're available, they're going to go and take your call. But if you call and all their people are already out on calls, they're just going to tell you can't do it. And frequently, if they have a choice, let's say two calls come in simultaneously, one from the state and one from another customer, and they know they're going to get paid more by the other customer, they're going to take the one that pays them the most money. So it's one thing if we have a contract, but if we don't have the certainty of demand, we may find that we have the inability to satisfy our demand when we need it with a single award. So multiple awards equals a win-win situation. It minimizes the risk to all parties. It minimizes the fact that the vendors don't have to maintain this constant capacity. They can, at the time when we have a need, simply tell us, yes, I can, or no, I can't. If they can, fine. If they can't, we move on. So they're not left in the position they have to provide it. And on the other hand, we don't pay for them to have that idle capacity just sitting around waiting. Plus the fact we get our demand satisfied in almost all instances from some vendor somewhere up and down the line when we need it. Let's see, here's what you should have when you have a multiple award situation. This is what you will say in your specifications. And this is going to be new to some people because a lot of people don't do some of the things that we are going to tell you. And that's why we're telling you this is what you should do. So you should, number one, state that multiple awards will result from the solicitation. What you should not do is what is at the bottom. We reserve the right to make multiple awards. And that's all you say. That isn't good enough. That doesn't tell anybody anything. It doesn't allow vendors to really know whether you will, you won't, how you will use them, etc. So we're going to go back up and say the rest of the things now. You should identify either the specific number of awards, 2, 3, 5, or the methodology that will determine the number of awards. We have 100 clients to be served. You will come in, you will say how many clients you want to be served. We will make awards until we get to the point of 100 clients being served. So if one vendor says they can take 30, another one says they can take 20, another one says they can take 15, you can award to everyone till they get to the point of 100. So you don't know whether that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 5, how many. You just have stated the circumstance that's going to say, here's how many we will make awards to. Now, something that does come into play is when you do it that way, and the two typical ways are the number of clients to be served or the number of situations to be served or the amount of money. Those are two typical things when you don't state the maximum number of awards. And the issue that you may run into and you should address is what happens if you give the first 1, 2, 3 all the money, all the clients, et cetera, they ask for, and you still need another vendor to get to your finite capacity, what you need to have served, but they are offering more than what you have to award to them. So what do? Do you say you the vendor, have to take just a partial amount of what you're offering? Or do we say, which I don't recommend, what I usually recommend in that circumstance is that we say that in the event we have to go to a vendor and offer them less than what they have offered to provide, we will need their concurrence that they're willing to give us just partial, because they frequently will have cost considerations. And we can't change their cost if they're not, which was predicated upon a full factor of clients or whatever we're talking about. So we can go to them and offer them partial. If they say no, the other thing we should reserve the right to do is in the event that the last vendor in line turns down a partial award, we can have the right to go back to the other vendors to see whether they will each increase the number of clients or whatever they will take at the same price. Still trying to get to the fact that we're going to award up to the point that we want to award to satisfy our demand. So, and the other thing that has to be done, and I'll say one more thing. I was going to say one more. Oh, when you say a finite number, a finite number, you generally have language that says we anticipate to make up to 3, 4, 5 awards. You use the word up to, but then you don't just say that in a very nebulous or wishy-washy fashion. What you should say is we will make this number of awards as long as we have that number of vendors who have responded, who are deemed to be, depending on the procurement method, either responsive, definitely responsible, maybe reasonably susceptible, whatever the criteria is. In other words, we're not saying that we're going to award to 5 even if we don't have 5 that respond or 5 are not qualified to do the work. But if we have 5 qualified, then we will make 5 awards. So that's what the finite number means. And the other thing you should say, and this is what is very frequently lacking, how the awards or the usage will be made, how they will be apportioned among the contractors. It's one thing to say we're going to make 3 awards, but if you're one of those 3 vendors, how do you know what business you're going to get on the basis of being one of those 3 vendors? And it shouldn't be just, well, who do I like the best? It should be prescribed in your specifications how you're going to use them. And now we're going to talk about how you can possibly use the vendors. A multiple award solicitation should identify how awards will be made among the multiple contractors, and here's the ways that happen. Right of first refusal, secondary competition, weighted usage, hybrid, other. And if you see right down at the bottom, in small letters, tucked away, fine print, and maybe it shouldn't be fine print, but preferably not even or round robin usage, and we're going to get to that. That is the least preferred, and I'll explain why. How to get the best price. Vendors bid offer better prices when they know what they are getting. Vendors know what they are guaranteed to get, likely to get, etc., or that they have the flexibility to turn down a request. That's important. It makes a big difference to a vendor whether they have to supply everything you ask them to when they don't know when and where, or whether they can take it if they have the ability or not take it if they don't. And it's especially problematic, as I'm going to tell a certain agency when I finish writing a review of their solicitation over the weekend, that what they have structured with an indefinite quantity with a single vendor who has to provide service throughout the state for something like 12 different facilities ranging from the Eastern Shore to Western Maryland. And they have built in a penalty, not penalty, damages. They have built in damages if the vendor is not able to respond. And I'm going to tell them then what they might do is end up with nobody responding at all, because, and this is for nursing services, where we have a nurse that's scheduled at a certain location, let's say in Cumberland, and the morning when they're supposed to come to the 3 p.m. shift, they call in sick. So you call this vendor and say, I need a nurse in Cumberland at 3 p.m. You got like 5 hours to find somebody. Well, that's one thing if they can try to find somebody, and if they can, provide them. It's another thing if they try, can't, and oh, by the way, we're now going to deduct money from you because you weren't able to satisfy the need. That's either going to scare vendors away, or they're going to charge you more to pay for the instances when they have to pay you back in damages. So the way you structure it has a lot of effect on who's going to bid or respond and what they're going to charge. So that's just an example. All right, let's see. When they know what they're getting, when they can have the flexibility to turn down a request, whenever they don't have capacity, whenever they can make more money elsewhere. And that can be part of the equation from a vendor. They want to make money. And in our society, that's not supposedly a bad thing, unless we deem it to be excessive. Vendors usually quote lower prices when they have flexibility. Lower prices for the state usually is a better deal than constant guaranteed capacity. All right, now we're going to start going through the methodology of how you decide which vendor, which of the multiple awardees gets a particular instance of need. Right of first refusal. And that is the right of the best contractor to have the first opportunity. And we're going to define best contractor as either the lowest price or most advantageous. Most advantageous means in combination of both the technical and financial, the one that comes out number one. So that you will, in your RFP or IFB, describe which way it's going to be if you're using right of first refusal. It's going to be on order of price, or it's going to be on the order of overall ranking, maybe some other methodology, but you're going to describe that in your solicitation. Let's see. So you go in the order of, you start with the best contractor, you offer them, they have the right of first refusal. You're going to go to them first and say, here's what I need, can you provide it? Usually you give them half hour, something like that, to come back and say yes or no. If they say yes, they get it. If they say no, you move on, and if they don't respond within the time frame you've given, you move on to number two, give them the opportunity. And you keep doing that until you get to somebody who can satisfy your need, or you go through all your vendors and you don't have anybody satisfying your need, in which case you either do without, or you do an emergency, or you do a small procurement, whatever the case may be. But at least you have the flexibility to go through multiple vendors to see who has the capacity right then and there to provide what you need. And you have more likelihood with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 than you do with 1 to get your need satisfied. And each contractor's price is what they bid or quoted at the master contract level, because that is another requirement. They must give you a price at the initial procurement stage. And sometimes that will be a finite price. In fact, in all circumstances but secondary award, it will be a finite price. And we will discuss secondary award shortly. Let's see, if the best contractor declines in order of either price or composite overall ranking as identified in the solicitation, other master contractors will be given the opportunity to provide the needed goods services. The agency will continue contacting master contractors in the ascending order. I guess it's descending order. Oh, ascending, that's correct. Ascending order of either their price or overall ranking. So you start with 1, and ascending means then you go to 2, then you go to 3. So you're going actually from the better to the less good. So I guess ascending is right. At least I thought that was it when I wrote this. Until a contractor agrees or until everyone declines. So I've said that. In the unlikely event all contractors decline, the opportunity to provide the goods or services the agency needs to do a standalone procurement or do without. As per the caveat on slide 611, when contacting contractors in their respective award order, a particular contractor can be bypassed. We're going to get to this later, I guess on slide 611. But we also tell you in your solicitation to have sort of like a bypass factor, that if a vendor has a history of not performing, if a vendor has refused X number of prior occasions in a row or has not responded for X number of occasions, you can basically take them out of the mix. But you will explain that in your specifications so that you don't always, because one of the questions I used to get before we started using this technique is, well, we always have to go to number 1, and they always take the full amount of time, and they always come back and say no. Can't we just save the time and go to number 2? Number 2 is always able to satisfy the need, so why do we have to keep going to number 1 since they never come through and respond? And that's why you have this bypass mechanism to allow you in circumstances you pre-identify to do a bypass. And we'll explain a little more on 611. And let's see, advantages of right of first refusal. The lowest price contractor is obtained that at that point in time is able to provide what is needed. So it's almost like doing a procurement right at that point in time to say, who can give me this demand right now? And presumably the vendor that couldn't right then and there wouldn't respond. And if they're a master contractor and they don't have the capacity, they won't respond anyway. So this is sort of like almost as if you did a procurement right then and there for your demand right then and there by being able to go through a list of pre-identified vendors, pre-identified master contractors. So hopefully that's clear. If not, when we get to the end of this section, you can ask questions. Disadvantages of the right of first refusal. Possibly lower prices or a better quality contractor could be obtained if a real-time standalone procurement was done. One of the disadvantages of multiple awards is people have to lock in their prices in advance. And when you are locking in your prices, if you're a vendor, and we talked about this issue of risk, what are you going to lock yourself into? If you're a prudent vendor, you're going to bid relatively high because you don't know when the state's going to come knocking on the door and saying, all right, provide what I need. And so you may hedge your prices a little bit. Whereas if we would do let's say a small procurement right then and there, and they know that it's for an occasion right now for this, within this degree, here's what I have to give you, they may be able to give you a better price knowing the specific timing and circumstances. So it's a trade-off. The flexibility and the quickness of getting an award through master contract versus maybe you're getting the best price, maybe you're not, versus doing a standalone. But you do master contract awards or multiple awards because you don't have the time typically to do these standalone procurements. So that's a disadvantage though. Maybe your decision is it would only take a small procurement, so I would go and do a small procurement and expect them to respond in one day, so I'll do that instead, but that's a possibility. And the other disadvantage is once you do this, those are the vendors you're going to deal with for the duration of the contract. So anybody else that's out there, if they didn't respond the first time, if they didn't win the first time, if they didn't even exist as a company the first time, they are excluded until you go out and do this again. And we sometimes get complaints from vendors about, well, how can I get into this closed network of vendors? And the answer is, well, until we do this procurement again, you can't. So from their standpoint, it's a disadvantage. From the state standpoint, we went through the process, we made the awards, and we'll use it until we go and do it again. Now, typically, you're not obligated to use this contract to satisfy a need. Usually, you'll give yourself some leeway, but if you don't use this contract, you have to go through a procurement of some kind to get your needs satisfied. So that's the alternative. Disadvantages. The award methodology could be counterproductive to getting low prices. And by this, I mean if there is a cost for vendors to be a contractor, but no way to recoup those costs for vendors that aren't getting business, the vendors who are lowest in may not gain business if they are not lowest in price. So vendors may not want to risk not being the best contractor and being saddled with costs that are not offset by revenue. And I understand that it's probably difficult to understand what I just said because I didn't say it very well, and this takes a little bit of thinking. So let me go through the next slide or so and see if that clarifies it. No, it doesn't. Oh, yes, we're talking about possible uncompensated costs. So what this issue is you know if you're low bidder, you're going to be the one the state comes to first. So if there's a cost to be in business that you have to recoup through this contract, you're going to get those costs paid for because you're going to get business. If you're 2 or more particularly 3, etc., well, you don't know if you're going to get any business. You don't know if number 1 is going to take up everything, and so maybe you never get a call to provide what is needed. But if you have to maintain some kind of capacity or maintain some kind of expense, you have the risk of that expense. First, am I going to get any business to pay for that expense? And when you submit your bid, your offer, etc., you don't know whether you're going to be number 1, number 2, number 3, or not even in the master contractors that are awarded. So are you going to gamble everything on winning to be number 1? Or are you going to perhaps hedge your bets? Or are you even going to turn down? Do we give the vendor the opportunity to turn down being awarded a contract if they're not number 1? Because they may say to themselves, and I've heard this from vendors, I have to have a bond for this. So it doesn't make any difference whether I'm number 1, 2, or 3, I still have to have a performance bond or a payment bond. So that's an expense I wouldn't have if I would not have an award under this contract. You have mandated a higher level of insurance that I typically carry. So in order to even respond, I have to buy this higher level of insurance. I'm paying for that. If I don't get any business, nothing's paying me for those higher premiums. If they are not currently doing business in Maryland and we tell them they have to go out and register to do business in Maryland, they have to incur at least $300 just to get registered, maybe more than $300. If they get no business, they have no payback for that $300. If they have to get a license, there's an expense to that. Sometimes we say if you are a contractor under this procurement, you cannot be a contractor under another procurement, so they're giving up another opportunity. And there might be other things that they have to have the capacity. So, and the one that's always constant is if there's an MBE goal, every contractor and every subcontractor is on a monthly basis supposed to report usage. And even if they got no usage, they're supposed to report usage. So even though that might be a minimal expense, it is expense. So realize that These are some of the downsides of multiple awards. And there are some vendors that would rather not get an award than have to go and incur these costs just in the hope that they get somewhere in the hierarchy and used to some extent. So considerations. So we can allow bidders to opt out of being someone other than the first ranked vendor, so that they, hopefully if they know they can turn down being 2, 3, 4, etc., then they can bid a better rate to begin with because they're not required to do it. So this is just a consideration when you're planning. Should you do multiple awards? If you do multiple awards, how do you do the usage under the multiple awards? If you do right of first refusal, do you let them opt in versus opt out? All considerations. So let's see. I won't read the rest of that. That's kind of what I said. All right. So that is right of first refusal, and I think that is the methodology that is used the most. The second one is what is called secondary competition, and this is what, if you're familiar with the CATS contract through DO-IT, the Consulting and Technical Services Procurement, that is secondary competition. If DBM a couple months ago awarded a master contract for auditing services for the state, we have, I think, 19 vendors on that. All auditing assignments will be by secondary competition. I probably can think of other ones that we have. We used to have a contract for management consulting that we had by secondary competition. That's a very typical methodology, and this is where you think of the term task order. This is a task order type of environment, and a task order is secondary competition. And what that means is that we're going to go ahead and through the rules that I explained previously, we're going to identify master contractors. And for circumstances like for CATS and DO-IT, they actually have unlimited awards. And that's another circumstance. You can have unlimited number of multiple awardees. And if you have unlimited, or even if you have a great number, you still have to have the methodology for awarding. So with unlimited, and I think CATS has, I know they have over 300 vendors. Not for every functional category, but they have more than 300, maybe 400 or more. You're not going to have right of first refusal for 400 vendors. Plus the fact that at that level, you're talking about an initial review on very generic circumstances. So just because they win at a master contract level doesn't mean they have the capability or the best vendor to do any given specific instance where you need something. So the way that you, in that circumstance, get to who wins is what I frequently call a mini procurement. Master contract, you will have the vendor sign the state's contract, so all the terms and conditions are nailed down, and a not to exceed price is nailed down. But then each time there's an occasion where something is needed, the state will prepare a set of specifications, what's typically called a TORF, Task Order Request for Proposal, and they will issue that to all the vendors under the master contract, or all the vendors in a functional area of the master contract, and you give them those specifications. You ask them to respond with a proposal. You ask them to respond with a specific price for that occasion, and you do an evaluation, and you select which one wins that task order. That looks like and smells like a procurement, except that, number one, you do not allow the minimum 21 days necessarily that's required for a normal procurement. You allow whatever is appropriate in that circumstance. Nobody other than a master contractor can respond. And the award of that task order does not have to go to anybody for approval. It does not have to go to a master contract, a control agency. It does not have to go to the Board of Public Works. So you're saving time usually at the front end, you're saving time at the back end, and the sacrifice is you're dealing with a finite number of vendors, but if that finite number is 300, it's not very finite. So that's hopefully in a nutshell. Let's see if I want to point out anything else. Task orders issued to all master contractors, specific details, quota price, technical approach. The task order price can be lower than but cannot exceed the price quoted at the master contract level. As described in the master contract solicitation, the number of master contractors will be either finite or unlimited. We mentioned that. For a finite number, the not to exceed price quoted has a bearing on which vendor is selected. If you're only going to issue under secondary competition a specific number of vendors who get the award, the price they quote will be part of the determination as to which particular vendor is one of those master contractors. If it's unlimited, I don't want to say price is irrelevant, but it is not a factor in simply whether you are becoming a master contractor. That is on the basis of technical characteristics. But that price does constitute what they cannot exceed at the task order level. So it's not totally irrelevant, but it is not a factor in unlimited awards. Let's see. For an unlimited number of master contractors, not to exceed price quoted at the master level does not have a bearing on which vendors are selected. There is no incentive for a vendor to quote low. That is an issue. There is no incentive for a unlimited number of awards for a vendor to quote low. And actually, this is their incentive. Because, and you have to think about this, if the only purpose of a price in this circumstance is you have to be no higher than this when you quoted a task order, if you make it very low, which in the past some vendors have done, they have found themselves 2 and 3 years into time under the contract where prices have increased and they are still capped at that not to exceed price when they simply stop responding because they say, I can't respond and provide anything for those prices I quoted 2 or 3 years ago. So from a vendor standpoint, if it's unlimited number of awards for master contract, their incentive is to quote a high price so that over the next 3, 4, 5 years, that price will still be high enough that they can provide a quote, and if they can go much lower, they'll go much lower at the time the task order is issued. If prices have gone up, generally due to inflation or whatever, they still have a price they can submit to and be within their master contract cap. So just the realities of the methodology. The advantages will result in the lowest price that any contractor is willing to provide at the time of the mini competition. If we're doing a master contract award on July 1, 2010, and let's say it's a 3-year contract, and 2 years later there is a task order that is issued that has a 2-week response window, everybody knows that their quoting prices for this specific activity right then at that point in time. So whatever vendors are willing to quote for their prices right then, 2 years from now, the vendor with the lowest price, depending on how the award is made, might win, and that might not be the vendor that quoted the lowest price at the master contract level, as long as everyone is within their initial master price level. So that's what this point says, will result in the lowest price that any contractor, any master contractor, is willing to provide at the time of the mini competition, at the time of a task order being issued. Cannot quote higher. The anticipation is that when you do a task order, because the vendors are responding at a real point in time, they can really figure what they can price from a low price standpoint to get that business right then and there. So the hope is that through the competition of sending it to all the vendors, the master contractors, they will compete among themselves, and we will get essentially the same price we would have gotten if we did a standalone procurement, because we have many vendors pricing to a specific instance at a specific time. So in that instance, you have the benefit of saving time and hopefully don't sacrifice money because you're getting multiple responses right then and there with the lowest price they can provide. So that is an advantage. Disadvantages. Another layer of time and effort required to make a task order award. You have to prepare a task order RFP. You may take you several days, may take you a week, depending on how complex, may take several weeks. I have taken already more than 2 or 3 weeks just to prepare the task order specifications. If it's for something very complex, which in the IT arena, many things are very complex. So just because it is a secondary competition through a task order doesn't mean you skimp on what your requirements are. You still have to identify them. Vendors still have to respond. They have to know what they're responding to. So the time to design it, the time you give vendors to respond to it, the time that you take to evaluate it, that's still a time aspect versus we go to number 1 first, we go to number 2 second, etc., the right of first refusal. Let's see. If a given contractor never wins at the task order competition level, it may drop out of future competition. One of the factors that has happened in the past with this type of award is that as you went through the second year, the third year of the master contract, the number of vendors that responded kept dwindling. So depending on how many master contract awards there were to begin with, there have been instances where 3 years later we got down to 1 vendor was the only one who ever responded. So effectively we no longer had a multiple vendor scenario because only 1 vendor is responding. So at that point you shouldn't continue to use that contract. You should start doing standalone if you're not getting the benefit of the price competition or the other vendors coming in. So that is a disadvantage. If you have unlimited competition, that is one of the things that helps overcome that disadvantage. If you have hundreds of vendors, even if half of them drop out, you still have 100 and some vendors that can respond. So these are considerations of how you structure this. To help avoid master contractor attrition, master contractors can be required to compete. We can tell them, you must respond to every task order. Or this will be considered as an issue of responsibility in other contract awards. So you can say, if you don't respond to the task order, then we will treat this as an instance where you are not fulfilling a contract activity. We will take this into consideration for other contracts we do, other procurements we do. However, master contractors cannot be compelled to quote competitive prices. So if you say you must respond, and a master contractor really doesn't want to respond, and if they have done what is smart for them and bid a high price at the master contract level, they can always just come in with that original price and don't cut it 1 cent, knowing they're not going to be competitive, so they've gone through the motion just to waste their time and your time if they really don't want to respond. These are a lot of ifs and what could be and maybes and things, but just letting you know these are considerations. And let's see, there can also be the uncompensated costs, the same as we explained a little bit ago. Disadvantages of a finite number of awards. If vendors quoted low rates to be one of the selected master contractors, over time these rates can become unprofitable for the now master contractor. Depending upon what is allowed by the master contract, such master contractors can stop responding. Just mentioned that. All right, so that is the secondary competition. So that is the second most frequently methodology for multiple award usage. Unfortunately, the third most common usage for multiple awards is what is called round robin or even usage. If I make 5 awards, you get the first one, you get the second one, you get the third one, you get the fourth one, you get the fifth one, you don't get anything, you get the sixth one, you get the seventh one, you get the eighth one. What is the advantage of anybody quoting a low price? Because if you think about it, the vendor that quoted the lowest price gets no more usage than anybody else. And so the fact they quoted the lowest price, since they don't get any more volume to make up for that price, they're actually getting less total money than their other companion contractors who bid higher. So they have less benefit by being the low bidder. And the other issue is that since it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, number one may get that first usage may be a relatively small need. Number two might get something that's bigger than one. Number five might get something as big as the first four combined, just because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it doesn't go into consideration of other aspects other than we're going to take it in the order in which vendors are listed. So that is, it has the advantage, and maybe I should go through these rather than just describe them. Used in rotation will receive virtually the same number of task order awards, but the value of respective task orders may be different. For the reasons described in the slides, we do not support round-robin usage. Example, if there are 4 master contractors and 20 task orders are issued, each will get 5 task orders. If there are 22, 2 will get 6, 2 will get 5. So you see it's almost even usage. Advantages, it is easy to administer. Can you count to 5? Can you count to 5 knowing that 2 comes after 1, 3 comes after 2? If so, it's very easy to do, no question. It has the appearance of being fair to contractors. Well, you're all being used equally, so who can squawk? Because you're each getting the opportunity one after the other. It avoids the issue of potential uncompensated costs. So that issue isn't here because we're saying as long as we have at least 5 task orders, everyone's going to get some business. So you know you're not going to have the uncompensated cost situation that you might have under right of first refusal or secondary competition. So that's an advantage. However, and you might remember on Monday I emphasized and even pointed out with the pointer that one of the requirements for multiple award was, and I asked you the question, what does it mean that you have to maintain the principles of competitive solicitation? Because that is directly from COMAR 2106-0306, I think it is, whatever it said back in the slides before. We have to maintain the principles of competitive solicitation, which I explained on Monday, means you bid lower, you get more volume. You get rewarded for having bid lower. And under round robin, you don't. You have no more advantage, and as I explained, you might actually get less business, less money than the other people, the other vendors who quoted higher prices. So you get no more benefit for being best than the other vendor, not as good. If you were the best under a competitive solicitation, you're rewarded by getting more business. Best in terms of price and technical, etc. That's what best means. Disadvantages. Can be a disincentive to vendors to try to be the lowest in price. All I want to do is be one of the vendors. I don't want to be lowest price because that means I'm going to make less money. So I'm not trying to be lowest, I'm just trying to be among the awardees. So maybe they're not competing on price, they're just trying to guess, are 4 vendors going to bid lower than me or 5 vendors going to bid lower than me? Not that I want to be the lowest, I just want to be among the maximum that's going to be awarded. Since you have to abide by the quoted prices, let's see. Vendors have to abide by quoted prices. They have to provide the qualitative superiority, which generally has a cost element to provide, but they get no more benefit. All of this violates the concept of lowering prices to gain volume, which overall produces more return for a vendor. So it is contrary to that. From an agency perspective, so it's one thing to look at it from a vendor perspective, it's another thing to look at an agency. You are the health department, you're the Department of the Environment, you're the Department of, what is that? Budget and Management. I had to think for a moment. So let's say there's this award, and you know there's 5 vendors that have an award. And all right, I know that one is better than the other. I know that number 1 is the best. I just know because they have the lowest price. I know they're the best qualitatively. So I want the best vendor. I don't want 2, 3, or particularly 5, because I'm going to be paying more money and they're not as good. So let me see. I'm going to call up the agency who issued these multiple awards and say, All right, if I'd give you a task order right now, which contractor would get it? Well, it's going to be vendor X, which is number 5. All right, I'm not going to submit a task order because I don't want number 5. I'll call you back in a week and see where we are in the order, or maybe I'm your friend and I say, call me when number 1's the next one up. So you can have agencies trying to play games to try to determine which vendor they're going to get assigned to do their work, both from a qualitative standpoint and in particular from a money standpoint. I want the lowest priced vendor to do the work because I don't want to pay anymore. So you can have that situation from an agency standpoint. I talked about the issue of it assures, let's see, from an agency perspective, virtually assures that higher prices are paid or low quality received than with the other multiple award scenarios, because it is not through secondary competition that you're making the best award and you're not automatically starting with the low bidder. So it typically is going to result in higher prices than would otherwise be the case under those other multiple award methodologies. I went through that. Disrupting the flow of awards due to agencies continually seeking to learn which contractor they would get if they submit a request at any given point in time. Seeking to temporarily rescind a request until another agency got a particular contractor. No, I'll stand aside. MDOT, you go first, MDOT. Or, oh no, DHR, you go first. We'll let you go first. I'll wait till I get back to number 1 again. Could happen. Refusing in a non-mandatory usage situation to use the master contract if they had no control over which contractor received their award. If you go to DGS, you don't have a choice but to use DGS contracts, but if you're any other master contractor, you can use it or not use it, so that may be a reason why you opt out of using a master contract and do your own procurement if you can't determine which vendor is going to win your particular award. Now, if all 5 of them are very good, and all 5 of them have almost identical prices, not an issue. But if that's not the case, it may lessen the usage of the master contract, and that kind of defeats the purpose of doing it. Now here's a methodology that I have never used. I don't know of anybody that has ever used it. I will throw it out there as a possibility, because what I said is you have to tell them how usage is going to be apportioned, and the first 3 are definitely by far, well, from what I just said, they're the only ones I know that have been used. So I will throw out another one, even though it's not likely to be used. Weighted usage means a finite number of awardees, usually 5 or fewer, that have a pre-established percentage of expected usage. It cannot be guaranteed that the projected usage will be attained, but the awarding agency will make a reasonable effort to try to get as close to this percentage as possible. And this will make sense a little more when I go to the next couple slides. It will be virtually impossible to make awards that exactly result in the goal percentage. Let's see. So just going to go through these examples very quickly. If you say I'm going to make 5 awards, you can say that we will try to give vendor number 1 30%, number 2 25%, number 3 20%, number 4 15%, and number 5 10%. So that everyone's getting some usage, but the better you are, you're still getting more usage than somebody that's not as good as you from a vendor standpoint. So that is an advantage of going to this methodology, even though it's difficult to apportion exactly 30, 25, 20, etc., but you will try. If you're making 4, and these are just illustrative, 40%, 30, 20, 10. So you can see number 1 is getting more than number 2, etc. 3, 50, 30, 20. You can have different percentages. 2, 60, 40. Advantages has the few advantages of the round-robin approach, plus is closer to the goal of adhering to the principle of competitive procurement. Disadvantage has all the disadvantages of round-robin approach, but to a lesser extent. So if you go back and review those advantages and disadvantages, they kind of apply to this as well. Hybrid, or a combination, and you can do this. And this requires some thought, but that's what you're doing at the planning stage. You're thinking. You're taking all these aspects into consideration and deciding in advance what do you think is going to give the best result for the state for what you need. So a combination of consolidated solicitation with limited multiple awards. For example, you can award a single contract for each topical, functional, or geographic area, and let's say for some of them, you can make a secondary award. So if we have an eastern region, a western region, a central region, typically central is going to be much bigger than the usage for eastern and western. So you can say one award for Western Maryland, one award for the Eastern Shore, 2, 3 awards for Central Maryland. So you are combining things. Or another thing, and I've done this, the last one up there, the secondary contractor for a given area might be designated to be a secondary contractor for all areas. When we had the foreign language interpretation contract, we made one award for telephone interpretation, one award for written document interpretation, and one award, we made one award for on-site interpretation, meaning that someone's actually going to a meeting and doing a real-time interpretation present at a geographic location. So one's by telephone, one's just written document, one is in person. We said we would make multiple awards for the on-site awards. And the procurement officer was the individual, stand up and say, hi. She was the procurement officer for the foreign language interpretation. And if I say anything wrong, she's going to correct me, because this was 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago. See, I already don't remember. That long ago? Doesn't seem like 4 years. So I forget many things. And we made multiple awards for the on-site because it's going to be more difficult to get a person to go to a particular location for a particular duration by a particular time than it is to send them a document and say, translate this, a written document. Or there are vendors, there are national vendors that have people with telephones that they can have 100 people that, for instance, might be able to translate French. And so if you make a phone call, they may have nobody at a particular one central location, and they may have their network automated so that the first French call comes into somebody in Milwaukee. And let's say if there's another call at the same time, that call goes to somebody in Chicago, because they have people who are designated to take the calls that have been qualified by them, and they indicate their hours of availability. So they can handle calls from virtually anywhere in the world remotely by telephone. So we have all three of those. We had multiple awards for the on-site interpretation, and what we said was the vendor who was the secondary contractor for on-site could also be a secondary contractor for written document interpretation and telephone interpretation if there were a situation where the number one vendor couldn't satisfy the need. So we didn't specifically make multiple awards in telephonic or written document, but we had the ability through the one where we did make multiple awards to, in effect, have secondary vendor. Does that correctly describe it? So I'm not totally over the edge yet. Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. Let's see. Oh, all right. I didn't know I had this on here, so I could have saved myself the effort because we already said it. Let's see. The RFP provided the backup could also be secondary. Okay, said that. Can have various combinations, right of first refusal to a certain award amount and secondary competition after that. For cable and wiring procurement about 4 years ago, before DO-IT came into being and IPPM was still doing all the IT procurements, we did cable and wiring that we would use right of first refusal up to $25,000, and above $25,000 we would do secondary competition. So that's a combination. The ones that are small, that can be handled easily, that you want to do quickly, just 1, 2, 3 in the order of their price, etc. And if it's getting into something more expensive, we will do a secondary competition. So that's an example of advantages: can customize solicitation to maximize the benefit of each multiple award component. Disadvantages: more complex than simply following a single award procedure. Examples of creative award rationale. And here's some things that I have seen that are multiple awards that didn't follow any of the ones that we have described so far. And just to show you that you can customize. You can come up with your own as long as it makes sense and you explain it in the solicitation. If there is an activity with 6 functional areas and there are to be 3 awards, evaluate and rank each offer within each functional area to determine the 3 best. So the 3 best for functional area 1, the 3 best for functional area 2, the 3 best for functional area 3, etc. Excuse me. Combine the composite technical ranking for each offer with the price rankings to determine the 3 best overall. So maybe you might have a vendor that is number 4 in all 6 areas, but the vendors that were 1 and 2 might in some areas be 5 or 6. So maybe when you get right down to it, the number 4 in all areas might be higher than the vendor that's 1 or 2 in some of the areas. And under this methodology, they were simply taking overall the 3 that on a composite basis scored the best. It's a methodology. In that particular instance, and that was MDOT that did this, that this was for planning services and for transportation needs. Excuse me. And what they said is they knew all the vendors that responded would be totally capable of doing all the activity they would need. The only question, some would be a little better than other ones for certain types of work, but not to a great degree. So they were willing to take the 3 best in combination of what they were offering and price and just give them anything they needed. And I said, fine. It satisfies the principles. You told them how awards would be made. You're taking the 3 best, etc. And I think within the 3 best, they went round first refusal then. When the contract is used to determine which of the functions. When the contract is to be used to determine which of the 6 functional areas is the most, this is continuing on that theme. Determine which of the 6 functional areas is the most appropriate for what is needed, then offer the usage opportunity to the contractor in the order of their rank in that functional area. This gets confusing, so you can read that. If you have questions, you can ask it, but it just shows you can customize. Other means to decide on usage among contractors. It is theoretically possible to devise other schemes than what I have just presented to allocate usage among multiple awardees. Whatever process will be used for making task order awards or for usage allocation should be described in the solicitation. It has to be known up front. You can't simply decide after the fact who you want to use based upon whatever criteria you use to decide who you want to use. And vendors have no way of knowing up in advance how you're going to do it. That is inappropriate. Caveat, for any award situation there can be, and this is the thing I mentioned, this is slide 611, but we said we were going to amplify the bypass scenario. For any award situation, there can be conditions, caveats that allow deviation from what is normal, i.e. a particular master contractor can be bypassed or not allowed to participate in awards if there are performance issues on other task orders. There are conflicts of interest. If the vendor requests that you don't use them for that circumstance or any other pre-existing circumstance that you describe as a bypass mechanism, then if that circumstance occurs, then you can bypass a particular vendor. Such as we said earlier, if you haven't responded to 3 or 4 or 6 consecutive task order requests, we're going to drop you out of competition until you come back and give us an assurance that you will respond in the future, and if you never come back and give us that insurance, you won't be back in as long as this master contract's in effect. So you can think of these type of mechanisms. And I think that's what just going to talk about. The solicitation, this is another example for round robin or weighted. Could specify if the bypass is temporary or permanent. Temporary. If 1 turn is missed, the vendor will be given 2 turns in the future, so we'll still have the same number of awards as if it would have had if the situation not occurred. Permanent, no attempt will be made to make up for a lost term. In other words, if we bypass in a round robin or weighted usage scenario, which we recommend you don't use, but if you use them anyway, if you have one of these bypass mechanisms and you bypass a particular vendor, does that mean they missed their turn, or does that mean we will try to make up for their missed turn later? And the one way is temporary, and if they miss it permanently, then it's a permanent. So, any questions on multiple awards? And you're saying, my main thing is I survived you talking about multiple awards. How many think that's the best thing they can say, they survived? We have one taker, a brave soul. The rest of you are thinking it, you just didn't want to raise your hand. And Gary wants to say something.
Anybody here from ADAA? Okay, so the ADAA placement solicitations were multiple awards. And they had the provision in there that after 1 year, we could use outcomes, which is what we really need to focus on with what we're doing. We could use outcomes as the basis for placement. And these are very rigidly managed. ADAA has a terrific numbers system, management system in place. And we were looking for the best result for the patients, which actually lowered our costs overall. And that was one of the, I thought, more cleverly designed solicitations, multiple awards.
And when it went to the Board of Public Works, they liked it. So that's just an example of how you can devise multiple awards and usage. And they customize to say, we're going to use this mechanism for the first year, and from the second year on, we're going to use a different mechanism. It was in the solicitation, they did it. And because they had a good result, they're going to use it in the future again, and probably try to apply it to other contracts, I guess, if they make sense under other circumstances. So there's a lot of things you have to think about when you are planning procurements. And probably I'm telling you many more things to think about than you might have thought that you had to think about. And I'll continue to tell you more things to think about, and you'll give up even trying to think about them because it's too much to think about. Say that 20 times quick. And we will not do any more exercises. Contract management plan, state the contract purpose and scope. So we're going into a different topic, the topic of contract management, that we're not going to spend much time on because we have a 5-day class coming up starting in about 2 weeks or so on Perform, which is essentially contract management. So this is going to be just a very, very brief overview. In the contract management plan, you will state the contract purpose and scope. You will develop procedures for initiating and processing change orders and modifications. Now, for many contracts, that doesn't really make sense. That isn't something you anticipate doing. There's other contracts where you know you're going to have change orders. If it's an IT development contract, you know that when you get into it, something's going to change over time because you're going to find different circumstances than what you anticipated, so something's going to change. So you will have procedures to initiate and process change orders and modifications when it makes sense. For any contract, you might do a modification. Acceptance of contract deliverables. You should have a plan, and you should know what constitutes a vendor performing under that contract so they're entitled to get paid. In most instances, that may be very easy, and in some instances, that may not be easy. And that is, we go through that a lot in the Perform class of how do you know whether the vendor's done what you want them to do? Because they're always going to tell you, I'm done. Here's my bill, pay me. Tomorrow would be fine. Today would be better, pay me. And from your standpoint, it's, wait a minute, let me see if I should pay you. But if you don't know what the criteria is to decide whether they've performed, you're not going to know whether you should pay them or shouldn't pay them. They're not going to know when they're really entitled or not entitled. So they're going to bill you as soon as they even think they might be entitled. And if you don't know, you may pay them, and we may be paying for nothing or for less than we should be paying. So you should have acceptance criteria for deliverables. You need to decide for a given procurement how complex that acceptance criteria needs to be. If it's give me 12 widgets, whatever widget is, you know whether 12 widgets have been delivered to you by the date you said to deliver them, whether they comply with, they're the widgets, yes, it's 12 widgets, so I can count 1 through 12 and they're here by the time specified and it's the price that they quoted, so I pay them. If it's designing a new birth, death, marriage program or process, what's the system, whatever the terminology is, that's going to be much more difficult to ascertain. Does this system for registering births and deaths and marriages and divorces work the way we intended for it to work? A lot more difficult to know what is acceptable. So you want to do that. And you want to have a procedure for authorizing invoices. Who's going to authorize them? How are they going to know what they should authorize? I know part of the standard procedure is it goes to accounts payable, and usually accounts payable, unless someone tells them not to pay something, they pay it. Well, if it's automated that the default is to pay it, which I know with the 25-day window that they're supposed to pay all bills is kind of what they're doing, somebody needs to, besides accounts payable, get the invoice, and that somebody needs to know what's supposed to be done, and they need to let accounts payable know if they shouldn't pay. But that should be established in advance, and you should create a contract compliance or a contract performance checklist so that you will know whether vendors have performed. And we go over that a lot more detail in Perform, maybe even in this class. Yes, we do in this class. So the performance checklist will have major contract activities such as, and these are just illustrative of what might be on here, a quarterly review, a project briefing, milestones, deliverables, MBE participation, other obligations of the contractor, other obligations of the state. Not very specific, this is very generic. We are more specific in Perform. And we have another exercise that you're not going to do. See how we can fly through these slides? Solicitation approval. As part of the planning process, you need to send the specs to a control agency in most instances. If it's within your delegation, you're either just going to Gary, or maybe you can do it even within your agency. But depending on the dollar volume, if it's over $100,000, if it's a service, it's going to come to DBM. If it's over $50,000 and its maintenance is going to go to DGS. Over $25,000 and a commodity goes to DGS. If it's over, I don't know what DeWitt's delegation is. If it's over $100,000 for DeWitt, for IT, it's going to go to DeWitt. So at some point, many solicitations are going to end up going to a control agency for approval. And I know that something I hear frequently is, okay, you obviously have devised some strategy for how long something's going to sit at DBM before it gets acted on. So we know that we can figure it's going to take at least 3 weeks, and if it weighs more than 2 pounds, it's going to take 5 weeks, and if it has crinkled edges, it's going to take 7 weeks. I mean, it's all very scientifically determined in advance how long it's going to take based upon non-substantive characteristics. And of course, that's not true, but I will tell you that things will take longer if you don't follow the types of things that we are saying. And just to illustrate that nursing contract I mentioned a few minutes ago, the agency has been waiting 2 weeks now. Well, I first responded to it about a month ago. And within about a week, they sent back another version which addressed about half of the points that I said. And they addressed all the simple things. But the things that required a little more thought, and a little more analysis and creativity, they basically said, we want to keep what we have. And so I have spent, 3 hours, 4 hours writing up something about half done, and I'll finish it over the weekend to send it back to them and say, I'm very pleased that you've done half of what I said, and it's really nice that you want to stay with what you wanted, but here's the detail of why you will not stay with what you wanted if you want this to ever be approved by me. So if you want to get this approved and get it issued, do what I say. And I don't say things that are arbitrary. I say things because, and when I say I mean I and the analysts, the procurement analysts that work for me, of whom 3 are in the room, so they can attest to this. We're trying to help you. When we critique what you send in, it is not because we want to be arbitrary. It's not because we want to exercise that power. We just want to prove we're boss. So we have to make you jump through the hoops just to let you know that we're in charge. That's not what we do, right? Right? Well, Andrea said, no, that's not me. I want to whip them into shape. So, I will not comment on the Office of the Attorney General. One of the things we say all the time is your lawyers are your friends. Remember that. Okay, so listen. Gary doesn't think his lawyer is his friend. All right, moving on. Not part of the class. Solicitation approval. Internally within your agency, you have to develop a list of vendors. You have to know who you're going to send it to. You're going to certainly anticipate going to email and marketplace. It's something we said in the procure class, and we emphasize it here, is you should anticipate sending it other than just email and marketplace. Identify vendors. You will identify those vendors typically in the planning stage, so you know who you're going to send it to. Decide on the advertising efforts, email to marketplace and other, control agency. All right, so that's not going to say much more on approval, just because we talk about that in the overview, we talk about that a little bit in procure, so you just have to do it. And if you do everything right, you'll get speedy approval. Can Gary attest to that? Speedy and DVM don't go together. That's what Gary will say. No comment. All right. Moving on. We're going to move into another area. Statement of work quantity statements when purchasing like units. So we're starting with indefinite quantity or something that is based upon a unit basis. Units need to be similar or standardized so pricing can be compared among vendors, which means units needs to be defined in terms of quality and other circumstances. And we are just having a different agency. They just canceled a solicitation that they issued in January and spent a great deal of effort with getting responses, evaluating the responses, and it got to the point that they were ready to make an award, and they kind of missed something we said to them a number of weeks ago that they were supposed to do, and they did a fatal flaw, and the result was they have to cancel the solicitation and do it over. And the key problem in that solicitation was all the vendors bid to a pricing unit that was not defined. So what we said is, how does anybody know what they're pricing? We don't know if the prices are comparable. I don't even know. The thing that was surprising to me is supposedly what we have been told, that no vendors ask any questions about trying to clarify what they were pricing to. We don't know whether that's correct or not. All we know is in the final analysis, the procurement is rejected. They are going to do it over because they had the inability, from our standpoint, to even know what they were awarding. And by the unit being undefined, you have two circumstances that come into play. The first that most people would think of is you don't know what vendors are responding to, so you don't know if their prices are comparable. But the other one is that people don't usually think about is if you go ahead and somehow make an award and you have no protest and you simply go ahead with a vendor that seems to be lowest in price, When you start getting the performance and when you start getting the bills, how do you know what they're sending you a bill for if you don't know what the unit is that the pricing is based on? Should you pay it? Have they done it? You will have to define it when the contract is underway, and because we talked about the issue of ambiguity, if you make a determination somehow that this was a latent ambiguity, one that didn't surface until after the contract had been awarded, the vendor's interpretation will prevail over the state's interpretation. Not a good scenario to be in. So you need to define, if you have units, you need to define them. And in this nursing services, that's one of the issues. I'm going back to the agency. They have two types of nursing demand that they want. They want scheduled and replacement. I think that's the terminology. They haven't defined either one. And if you look at the circumstances in the RFP, you can't, and even though you have prices for these two different types of nurses, you can't tell when one applies and when the other applies. That's a problem. So you need to define it. We need to go to the issue of quantity. Well, let's see if I can get through this before break. Let's not. Why don't you take a break, come back in 15 minutes, and start with quantity statements.